Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Bunker Daily. My name is Nick Cohen. I write for The Observer, for all kinds of other newspapers. I do books. Our aim is to do an occasional series to help get through the sheer bloody tedium of lockdown by talking to contemporary authors with books out who have something to say. I'm delighted to say my guest is James Hawes. James, you there?
I'm here, Nick. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Good. I'm glad the technology is working. This is a major breakthrough. I wasn't even expecting it.
I made it through to the bunker.
Exactly. James, if you don't know his work, well, you really should. He's written a series of cool crime thriller novels in the 1990s, A White Merc with Fins being my favourite. He wrote a very, very prophetic book which never got the attention it deserved, called Speak for England, which predicted Farage, Brexit, and the awful mess we are now in. I really would urge you to read it. He is a polymath. He writes on Kafka. He's done a history of Germany. But the reason why he's been hauled into the bunker today is that he is the author of The Shortest History of England, which is both a history, a very entertaining history at times, but an argument. It's an argument about how England got its class system, its snobbery, and ended up in such a mess over Europe. Jim, your book on Germany emphasized that West Germany and East Germany were just fundamentally different places. Your book on England seems to say the same about the South and the North.
In a way, yes, it does. Because with the German book, the significance of the East-West split in Germany, which people really haven't understood in the past, it only became clear to me after years into the research, when I, so to speak, quite literally had the maps out in front of me, and I kept thinking, why has this East-West thing come up again and again throughout German history? And when I was writing this book, The Shortest History of England, again, I started out with no idea, really. I think if you'd asked me 3 years ago, when did the North-South divide become really important in England, I would probably have said, as I suspect a lot of people would say today, around the time of Margaret Thatcher. But as I went back to the beginnings, to the time even before English history properly begins, I found again that time and time again, this particular line, which is in practice the line of the Trent, was popping up again and again as the great watershed between two parts of England, which at times, and again, have been so different as to amount almost to different countries.
Well, the South is where invaders, where ruling classes have always wanted to base themselves, first of all, whether you're talking about the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and of course the Normans.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the strange thing about England is that, sadly, from the point of view of the North, there's this sort of awful triple whammy in geology, in geography, and in climate. Because by sheer coincidence, there's no necessary relation between these at all, but it so happens that if you look at a geological map of England, there's something very unusual about it. There are very few small, middle-sized countries which are so divided by a clear geological line. I hear geologists call it the Jurassic Divide, where the rocks to the southeast of that, which is basically the line of the Trent, are only about 60 million years old. They have chalk and lime soils. They're very fertile. Beyond that, we have the much, much older, 200 million years old igneous soils, which go right up into the Highlands of Scotland till they meet the great Glen in Scotland itself. And that means that the soils of the southeast are always going to be better, which until the Industrial Revolution meant your society was going to be richer because agricultural society was all there was. But also because of geography, it's meant, as you said, that's always been the place where new influences and new markets naturally come in from the continent. And finally, it has a better climate for agriculture as well. So throughout history, the southeast of England has always tended to be, frankly, the most desirable part.
Which kind of raises the question of what is England and Englishness, which I'm very struck by your writing, because this history, which I should say to listeners, you can sit down and read in a day. It's a beautifully written, presented and argued book. You keep biting away fighting back against traditional notions of Englishness. And you emphasize more than any writer I've read, I can't claim to be a great expert on medieval history, of the cultural catastrophe of the Norman invasion of England and how that has played out across the centuries and influenced not just the North-South divide, but influenced our notions of class, our notions of education, our notions of superiority.
Absolutely. I mean, the English at the time and for centuries after were well aware of this. I mean, if you look at what the very few writings there are in English before Chaucer, most of them make clear, and all of them implicit reference to this cultural catastrophe that overcame them, that made them, by definition, second-class citizens in what had been up till then their own country. And it's something which didn't happen anywhere else in Europe. Even in Russia, under the Mongols, a Russian-speaking elite, although they were satraps of the Great Khan, they survived as a kind of local elite under the Mongols. In England, the entire elite were replaced by a small band of people. Robert Toombs estimates it as only 8,000 men at first, who took over the entire country, who spoke a language completely incomprehensible to the vast majority of the people, and who simply ruled them as helots. And what's extraordinary is how long that continued.
Which is a hell of a long time. And in that time, all the laws are in French. If you want advancement, you have to speak French. If you want to, you have to assimilate with the new elite. You have to pass as Norman French.
Absolutely, and it was a long and grinding and really kind of demeaning process. We tend to think of the conquest as one afternoon, Hastings, but in fact William was very careful at first, and the whole process, which culminated in the Domesday Book, was a long process, a theatrical process of false legality, where the English were hauled into courts where they were only allowed to answer specific questions through a translator, in Norman French, in other words, which they didn't understand, about who owned the land. And it was taken from the owners over a period of about 20 years, in this sort of slow annihilation of a culture, which left these extraordinary scars. So that almost the most damaging thing about it is the fact that clearly the Normans weren't numerically large enough to actually run it personally. But what they did, as you just said, they persuaded or forced what was left of the English elite after Hastings to collaborate, to assimilate to them, to learn French and to talk French in public, thereby setting themselves publicly apart from their fellow Englishmen. And that's something which, frankly, is still the case today.
Yes, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but the point you make there is, to my mind, a fascinating one, is that, yes, you could join the elite if you were English, but you had to turn your back on your own culture. You had to work with them. It was an open elite. It wasn't an aristocracy in the sense of like the Polish aristocracy where, birth was everything. Yes, you can join, but only on our terms.
Yes, absolutely. That's this the unique skill and strangeness of the English elite ever since then has been the fact that it is exclusive, it is an elite, and it has very, very clear conditions of joining. And yet, if you fulfill those conditions, which are essentially to have money and a very specific sort of education, you can always get in. Unlike, as you say, the other aristocracies in Europe, which remained castes.
And the children of Russian oligarchs are learning that to this day, aren't they?
They pack in because they know that if they learn to talk and act like they see in the Harry Potter films, they get to hang out with the Queen and so forth. It's an extraordinary. That's why the English elite is probably the most successful and, to other elites in the world, attractive elite in the world, because it's managed to combine this hereditary element and being open to new money in this very, very careful and frankly genius manner.
We get to the Renaissance, and finally, everyone in England is speaking English. They might be in dialects that are pretty much mutually incomprehensible, but they are all speaking the same language, and boom, again, suddenly class divisions through language are set up again through Renaissance humanism, through Latin, through Greek, again and again, no, we must maintain these barriers.
Absolutely. I mean, it's in the early 17th, in the early 16th century, sorry, then that Henry VII consciously brings in. Henry VII, by the way, spoke French better than he spoke English, almost certainly, and he brings in, from his exile in France, he brings in the latest French ideas, which is Italian humanism, and its signature is speaking Greek as well as Latin, and it's actually right up until 1919. You couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge to study anything without having both Latin and Greek.
You have a very good account of how this divided country, which lost its empire in France, or rather, it wasn't the English empire in France, it was the empire French overlords also had in France, why it became so successful. I think it goes back to your openness of elites point. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, I mean, this very strange thing happens in England. If we look at the situation of England at the end of the 17th century, it's essentially a failed state. We've had this extraordinary civil war, which killed more of us proportionally than the Germans would kill him for the First World War. And by 1689, it's quite clear that another civil war is in the wings. So what do certain members of the English elite do? It's really, when you think of it, the more you think of the matter is they invite the Dutch, repeat, the Dutch, to invade. They call it, in their historians and their tame journalists later call it the Glorious Revolution, but in fact it's a Dutch invasion. King William's forces insist that every English army unit move 20 miles back from London before they enter, and William's Dutch Blue Guards occupy all the central points of London for 18 months, while he essentially dictates terms to Parliament, having promised to come to free English liberties and so forth. He then insists he will not reign as regent, he will be King William, and if he doesn't do that, he'll bugger off back to Holland and let us fight it out. So you have this extraordinary kind of failed state inviting invasion by Holland, yet within 65 years, or 70 years, that state is able to mount simultaneous successful offences on other side of the globe in an age when a sailing ship was the fastest thing you had and no messenger could travel faster than the post horse. It's absolutely extraordinary. And what seems to have happened is the Dutch brought their financial innovations into England, and that England so accidentally hit on this ideal offer really to international investors, because we had a real king, King William and later King George, but we also had a parliament composed of what were called at the time Whig oligarchs, who were just businessmen on the make. And so they guaranteed your investment would be treated business-like manner, while having a king guaranteed a form of traditional stability. Now, no other European country could offer both of these. And it meant, quite simply, that throughout that long struggle with France in the 18th century, England was always able to borrow money, the sinews of war, as Cicero called them, at about half the rate the French were. That's why we won the long battle with France, because we'd managed to construct this extraordinary sort of fusion of aristocracy and business class, which we called gentlemen. And the Europeans were amazed. Every European language starts to use the word gentleman in the 18th century because they got no equivalent for this class of people who are both aristocrats and businessmen.
Do you think, I mean, I just look at Ferdinand Mount or Robert Toombs or all these people, or the long, long tradition of, which I still feel in some ways, of English people feeling good about their history. And you read your book and you wonder, well, how much this is our history? But you do wonder too, what does Englishness mean? Where does this leave Englishness? Where you have a colonial divide, and then a language divide, and then a class divide. How did you resolve that question yourself?
Well, with another question, really, which is to ask it again, because what we, again, I think tend to forget is that there has been no such thing as England, technically, as a separate state since 1707. I mean, England has been completely subsumed and, in a sense, submerged, first in Great Britain and then in the United Kingdom, since the Act of Union. When we changed to the UK, for example, the UK was a much stranger state than we think. This is the state which said England expects that every man shall do its duty to Nelson's men. But actually, that state was probably only about 55% English, and at least a quarter of its population didn't speak English at all. All the Irish, half the Scots, and lots of the Welsh. So what the UK was this extraordinarily successful multinational. It was a genuinely multinational, genuinely multicultural state in which, for example, having the Scots and Irish guards and lancers at your disposal was vital to the empire in campaign after campaign. That's what won and held the empire. It wasn't England. That's the strange thing that English people have got to get their heads around. England never had an empire. The empire was only created under Great Britain and then held and extended under the United Kingdom. It was never an English thing. So when English people stand up and say, yeah, we've lost our empire. No, sorry, mate, you never had one. We, as the United Kingdom, had one, but the English themselves never did.
We'll get to Brexit at the end, as we always do. Everything comes back to bloody Brexit at the bloody end. English parliamentary constituencies, election results when only really the upper class and the upper middle class could vote. This is before 1885 Representation of People Act. And Liberal and Conservative seats are dotted all over the country. 1885, after the Representation of the People Act, the beginnings of, we weren't a democratic country then, women couldn't vote, most of the working class still couldn't vote, but we were quite clearly becoming a democracy. Boom, that north-south divide comes straight back. There is a solid block in the lowlands beneath the Trent of Tory seats. And it's just the most extraordinary thing, because you suddenly see this north-south divide that people weren't thinking about. Boom, as soon as people have a chance to express their identities, they divide on the old lines.
I'm delighted you like that bit, because that was one of the things. That was one of those moments where I really kind of stood back from my own computer and thought, for God's sake, I'd never knew this when I first started to building up these maps. It really is extraordinary. You had the UK bestriding the world as an elite construct of these four different nations within it. As soon as they get the vote, the Irish immediately vote overtly on nationalist grounds, but the Scots and the Welsh immediately vote on implicitly nationalist grounds as well. And the Northern English vote completely differently from the Southern English. The line is there, and that line is never really broken. That solid block of Tory seats in the southeast has been practically impregnable to Liberal, then Labour tacticians ever since. It really is quite extraordinary.
Which brings us up to the present, because that map holds. Until then, if you wanted to beat the Tories, whether you were in the democratic age, whether you were first the Liberals and then the Labour Party, there had to be an alliance. The north of England had to ally with Scotland and Wales, and what seats in London, the south it could get, then you could beat the Tories. It was alliance of the north and the Celtic nations. And then you get to the 2015 general election when the SNP sweep Labour away, and suddenly, boom, that key part of your alliance has gone.
Absolutely. I mean, if one were if a Martian historian were writing the political history of these islands, they would say, there has been at various times in history, and certainly in the democratic age, it was in the Civil War was the same, by the way, this alliance of the Northern England, of, let's say, the English peripheries, sometimes including the extreme southwest, but mainly the north, and the Celtic nations to resist the power of the south. And in the democratic age, we have called that alliance the Labour Party. But as you say, when Scotland left that alliance, that party crumbs. Scotland, which had provided the first 5 leaders of the Labour Party, lest we forget. The thing with the Labour Party is it was never an English party.
Yeah.
The Liberals and the Conservatives.
That's a very good point.
The Liberals and the Conservatives both trace their antecedents back to the Whigs and the Tories, and through them to the actual sides in the Civil War. They are both English parties with English traditions. Labour never was. Labour is founded within the UK. Its first 5 leaders are Scotsmen, many of its later leaders are Welsh and so forth, and it always had its alliance of the Celtic nations English. That's what it was. So when Scotland's defection from that alliance is an absolute, it's not just a body blow, it's basically the end of the Labour Party as we know it. It has to be, because the Labour Party has never existed without that alliance.
Well, you mean Labour exists with Britain, and if Britain starts going, Labour goes with it?
Absolutely. I mean, Labour essentially has no chance and never has had any chance of winning in an England on its own. Yes,
just to remind listeners, we've had the 24 referendum, which the British side of Scotland wins quite comfortably, and says no, we want to stay part of the UK. Great. In the 2015 election, Cameron targets Labour and says, if Ed Miliband wins, he will be in the pocket of, the pawn of the SNP. If you want to protect England against Scotland, you must vote Tory. And people did, incidentally, in the South and the Southwest. It worked for them. But as you say, Jim, at the expense of making Scotland a kind of alien enemy state, the other.
To which the Scots responded by voting SNP. Exactly.
Yeah. So Scottish nationalism begets English nationalism, begets Scottish nationalism, and down the spiral we go. Do you think this is going to last? Do you think it's going to last with the Tories as the English party?
I think the evidence of our senses very clearly says no, because there's Boris Johnson celebrating his triumph. He's finally he's made the Tory party into functionally the English National Party. He's won this election. He's finally won seats. People in the North, many seats for the first time in their history, vote along with the South. It looks like national unity in favour of English nationalism. But then comes along a medical crisis. And somehow in England, and only in England, these discussions of how best to respond to an international medical catastrophe become framed as, guess what? The North-South divide. And suddenly, extraordinarily, you have Andy Burnham and the Red Wall Tories singing from the same hymn sheet, which is absolutely extraordinary. They are mortal enemies. The only thing which could possibly unite them is the fact that they feel accurately in their heart of hearts that they represent a different tribe.
I know. I haven't lived in Manchester. I was born and brought up in Manchester, and I haven't lived there since before most listeners to this programme were born. And when Andy Burnham started standing on the steps of the Free Trade Hall and saying Johnson's taking Manchester for granted, he's not even talking to our elected representatives about what's happening to Manchester business and Manchester public health, I was suddenly shouting, "You bastards, you southern bastards!" And my wife was giving me a look of, "What the hell is the matter with you?" A look I'm quite used to, I must say. And I just said to her, I said, "Look, this runs very, very deep. Even people who haven't lived in the North for virtually all their adult lives, in my case, are instantly aware of Southern condescension, Southern privilege, instantly feeling that somehow the Southern elite is somehow illegitimate, has no right to tell the North what to do and how to live."
I mean, that's the way we English think, and we only don't realise it because it's like one of those things where you have your fingers in front of your hand and you can just focus out and look through them at the rest of the world. But the hand's still there, and at any moment, in moments of crisis, or even just moments of social conflict in a pub, for God's sake, we immediately fall back into northern gits and southern bastards without thinking about it, because it runs so deep. And I think it's not just some. I'm not some mad Victorian vicar inventing this theory. I mean, no less than Winston Churchill in 1912 and again in 1913, when he was trying desperately to hold this, in my view, wonderful United Kingdom together, which then included Ireland, of course, he said that the only solution he could find, and he said it publicly and reminded electors the next year of what he'd said, the only way he could think of doing that was to split England up. Because England was too big, and of course Churchill being a liberal then, it was too big and too Tory. And there was no way in the democratic era that this vast block of Tory voting southern England could coexist with the United Kingdom. And his only solution was to split England up into what he called self-governing areas.
We are a long way from that, and this is very hard. I mean, I'm British. I see myself as British, partly because my mother's Scottish, my mother's family is Scottish. I find the idea of a border on the Tweed just horrific, and my mother being a foreigner in England and me being a foreigner in Scotland. But you said earlier on, you just think that it's gone too far now. I certainly think the Brexit vote pushed it too far. I think supporters of Brexit didn't realise that the EU was holding the UK together. I mean, obviously so in Ireland, where underwrote the Good Friday Agreement, and now we're having borders in the Irish Sea of trying to work out what the hell to do. Now we've left. But, I really don't like nationalists. But if I were a Scottish nationalist, I could say, well, hold on a second. The Scots voted in 2014 to stay in a UK that was in Europe, and Johnson and Farage have torn up that deal. And so, it's over. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I'm sure that was absolutely part of it. Although I suspect it's also gone, I think it's even gone beyond even that rationality now. There are times, I think, in the history of nations where people just get their bit between their teeth, frankly. And they're just not going to, the idea, probably objectively true, that Scotland would have an enormous difficulty in replacing the funding of the Barnett formula in any other way. Those arguments at certain times just go over people's heads. As I said, as Lloyd George tried to point out to Parliament about Ireland in 1919, it's just too late.
Yes. I mean, economically, Ireland from 1916 to 1921, the Irish could say, well, we'll be far better off staying in the UK. They probably wouldn't be. What's happening now is a sort of great refutation of materialist theories of history. Yes, the economics matter, but they don't. But if economics dominated, we'd never have had Brexit.
No, it's never been true. I mean, I know this is the age when all young people want to become spads and wonks and things. And I just want to say to them all, my dear children, politics is bunk. Do you not understand? The only thing you need to know about politics today, as Sir Patrick What's-it-call said, we are all ultimately valence voters.
Yeah.
We vote on the basis that we think this or that person or party in some way, in some deep but perhaps mysterious way, actually represents us as a tribe.
Yeah.
That's what we vote for. And that necessarily dooms the United Kingdom in the same way as the Habsburg Empire. I mean, in fact, the more you look at the politics of Britain before the First World War, the more similar it looks to the Habsburg Empire. Crippled. Our entire politics was crippled by the Irish question, in the same way as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was crippled by the Czech question. We were no more, doomed to succeed than they were doomed to fail. The United Kingdom has been in a state of decline, of imminent, essentially palpable collapse since 1885.
I remember Tom Nairn and other New Left historians making that point, donkeys years ago, and I thought, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. What do you mean we're like the Habsburg Empire? But they are turning out to be right, I think.
Well, yes, the Habsburg Empire, which we were all taught was doomed to collapse by nationalism, it actually lasted till only just before the German Empire fell. It outlasted the Russian Empire. Had they won the war, they'd no doubt have survived in some form or another. Had we lost, no doubt the UK would have been finished the next day. So we were held together. Essentially, the UK was held together by two world wars. But if you look at what people were voting at, don't forget there was a Home Rule for Scotland bill introduced in 1912 already, as part of the deal which Lloyd George and Asquith had to struck with the Celts.
Okay, Jim. Final question is this: England on its own. You're saying the North-South divide is back, and I think that's right. I think Keir Starmer is worrying perhaps a bit too much about red wall seats. But what will England alone be like? How do you see it?
I see it as being a place ridden with extremes, frankly. I think that the English it's been so long since the English have had to face up to the internal problems of England that we are facing some very, very serious rejigging. I find it hard to not sort of quote Powell and Tiber and much blood and things here, I'm afraid. I do not see it ending. I barely see it ending peacefully, frankly. I think we're close to the situation. We will be close to the situation in America, with two camps, two cultures, two camps, both of whom see it as a zero-sum game, and neither of which, particularly on the right at the moment, neither of which is taking any prisoners and has any fear of any extreme.
Yeah, on that grim note, I will say I think you're right. I will thank you very much for joining us. And I'm told by my bosses and the crack tech team who run this podcast, I must now read out an advert. If you're new to the bunker, there's a bunker every day. Monday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday are like this, about half an hour or so, but an extended panel edition every Tuesday. It's perfect morning listening, or indeed evening and afternoon. And people who run this don't realise that people listen to podcasts at all times of the day. They don't just listen in mornings. So do subscribe on your favourite podcast app. And you'd like to get the podcast a day early without adverts and back us on Patreon? I don't know. The crowdfunding platform. Please search Patreon Bunker Podcast to find out more. Jim Hawes, thank you very much.
Thank you.